Hello there, and welcome to Sync Music Matters, a podcast that explores the beautiful relationship between music and the moving image. My name is Jim Hustvedt, and I'm your host on this journey, as each week I seek to understand the people and the process behind the best music in TV, film and games. I'm talking to composers, but I'm also talking to editors, music supervisors, directors, and anyone else who's involved with the synchronous process of pairing audio and visuals. BAFTA-nominated Doug Bryson is a TV and film editor who, in his own words, tells stories with pictures that you might see on the telly. He has cut shows such as Grand Designs and 24 Hours in Police Custody, but is perhaps most recently known for his work on Mortimer and Whitehouse, Gone Fishing. If you aren't familiar with the show, it follows comedians and lifelong friends Bob Mortimer and Paul Whitehouse as they embark on fishing adventures around the UK and share their personal and hilarious experiences of life. It's a visual feast of picturesque landscapes paired with beautiful music, which is lovingly curated by Doug. Doug Bryson, thanks very much for joining me.
No problem at all.
So, I'll start as ever. If you could cast your mind back to a young Doug growing up on the streets of Stranraer, if someone had asked you at the time, what would you like to be when you grow up, what would you have replied?
That's a very good question, because for a very long time I had no idea what I actually wanted to do. I think it was the town that I grew up in it was so small, so kind of, it was one of those places where you either stayed there all your life or you got out as quickly as possible. I think it was, for me, when I was young, my kind of, escape from the mundanity of everything that was going on was just to watch telly. We didn't live near a cinema or anything. So I spent most of my time just watching telly. I was obsessed with Doctor Who. I was a massive Doctor Who fan from a very young age. So very much into sci-fi. And I do remember buying books and, getting the Doctor Who weekly comic, which would kind of, peel back some of the secrets of how they made these strange worlds and whatnot. And that kind of probably got my brain ticking, going, so these things aren't real. How are they made? Maybe I could do something like that. And I guess it's sort of, that's probably the seed of where my kind of first thoughts of doing something creative in that sort of sense came from, because I never really had there was nobody kind of in my family who had a very kind of defined career path. I don't think they weren't all doctors or they weren't all engineers or anything. Everybody kind of had their own sort of thing that they did. So my parents always just kind of encouraged us to kind of find our own way in it, I guess. And for me, I guess just over time, from just watching a heck of a lot of telly, that became my obsession and what I then wanted to kind of be a part of.
So what was your first dalliance with? Was it editing, or were you making home movies? What was your first experience of media?
I think the very first, if in terms of actual editing, because we're talking, I was born in 73, so this was, very analog days. So I think probably in terms of the first ever editing I probably did was probably on an old tape to tape cassette deck. Like I remember I used to listen to the top 40 every Sunday on Radio 1 and record the songs that I liked, but then I'd record out or cut out the DJ. So I'd then do tape to tape recording, so I just had the music. So that was probably the very first editing I ever did, audio wise. Video wise, it was probably, I do remember there was one time my mum was, she was in the Red Cross, sort of a local Red Cross group, and they used to do, sort of, I don't know what you would call them, but kind of like sort of special days where they would demonstrate, how to do first aid, that kind of thing. And for some reason or other, she was tasked, I think, with videoing some kind of, pretend incident. And I remember she brought home one day a massive VHS camcorder. This would probably have been in, I don't know, the very early 80s, and it was like a full-size kind of like VHS recorder. So it was almost like the size of an old VHS recorder, just as, you know, the recorder, and then the camera was a separate cabled thing to that. So you literally had to wear the VHS recorder on a strap attached to your back and then hold this massive camera to film something. So I remember kind of going, oh, this looks fun. So I kind of commandeered that, started filming some stuff around the house, filming the cat, that kind of thing. And I think at some point I worked out how to connect that video recorder to our home video recorder, and it was, you know, play on one, record on another, and, you know, some very, very rough assemble editing. So that was probably the very first thing I ever did. But yeah, beyond that, I didn't then, I mean, we only had that temporarily, so I never went out and started, you know, shooting my own things or anything. That was a kind of a one-off thing that just kind of got the juices flowing, I think.
Sure. So at what point did editing become, or, you know, media, did that become a potential career opportunity? And were there any sort of iterations of potential career paths prior to that?
It did take a while, because I think I was a very quiet child. I didn't, you know, I was never interested in football. Pretty much everybody, you know, in my class, that was what you did when you were a young kid, particularly a young boy. You just got into football, went for a kick around the park with your mates. But for some reason, sport just did nothing for me. So I was either, you know, watching telly or, you know, playing computer games, that kind of thing. I had an old ZX Spectrum with the rubber keys, and got into computer games. So I actually didn't have a large social circle of friends. So it was sort of... it wasn't really expected. I think my parents never expected me to kind of, you know, ever leave the town and actually go to university or do anything. They just thought, oh yeah, he'll just hang around and, you know, be one of those people who's still here, you know, in his 40s or whatever. But I think as I got older and, you know, started to kind of, you know, get deeper into how are these TV programs that I watch all the time, how are they made? And then going to see Star Wars at the cinema and just kind of having my mind blown by the possibilities of, you know, what people were putting on the screen. And I think that just kind of made me more and more curious and more interested in finding out how these things were made. And I think, you know, I remember buying the making of Star Wars, behind the scenes of Doctor Who, various things, and just working out, you know, how special effects was. And I think at one point I was sort of obsessed with special effects and really fancied kind of getting into model making and all that kind of thing. My brother used to make Airfix model kits of airplanes. And so he got into that, and I got... I think there was a Dalek model kit that I got at one point, and I also I collected all the Star Wars toys as I was growing up as well, and I would arrange them all out into kind of, you know, battle scenes, and then start taking photographs of them. Because we didn't have a video camera, it was photographs that I would take. But in a way, I guess that was sort of trying to tell a story visually, because I wouldn't let other people play with my toys. I like to kind of set them up to create something, take a picture of it. And that was, you know, a story that I had just for me. And so I guess all those things together sort of pushed me towards thinking about storytelling in some way, shape or form. And I think writing stories and doing English at school was one of my better subjects. I remember my granddad used to kind of encourage me to write, and he was the one kind of extended family member who was always kind of interested in the things that I would write or seeing the photographs of things that I'd taken and whatnot. Everyone else was a bit kind of like, oh yeah, you do what you do. Yeah, it's that's great. But they didn't have that same kind of creative brain or interest in that kind of creative side of things. So I think as time went on, I realized that, okay, if this is something that I want to do as a career, I'm not going to be able to do that if I stay in this town. So it was a very kind of last minute decision, I think, to actually go to university. As I came to the end of high school, I remember sort of looking around thinking, okay, where can I possibly go? And back then, there weren't that many university courses. I mean, there certainly weren't any in the volume that you get today, which are, they're so specialist in terms of visual effects, graphics, all the rest of it. Back then, it was film and television. That was all you could go and study. So I decided, okay, this is the only way I'm going to be able to do it. I have to go to university. So I ended up applying to Stirling University, to their film and media studies course, and shock to everybody, including my parents and me, I got in. So because I was so quiet and didn't have any sort of show reel really to kind of to show off, to actually show what I could do. It was very much kind of based on, you just apply and see what happens. It was a bit more kind of like TV journalism kind of based back then. It wasn't about making movies or making TV. It's sort of very much focused on the journalistic side of things, which I guess is that's still telling stories, but I saw it as a route into hopefully bigger and better things, and thankfully it was.
And you went to the NFTS after that?
Yes, so after university, I spent a year when I was at Stirling. I got on an exchange program, spent a year in California, which was, they basically had so much equipment and were so much more kind of creative and encouraged you to try every aspect of the filmmaking process. So they would like throw a 16mm film camera at you, go and get you to shoot your own stuff, edit your own stuff, entirely design the soundscape, mix it yourself, project it yourself. And I just kind of lapped that up and shot and edited as much as I possibly could. And that got me a show reel, which then allowed me to, when I finished my degree back in Stirling, I applied to the NFTS with a show reel, largely the stuff I'd made in the States, and got accepted on the editing course there. So I then spent 3 years out in Beaconsfield, purely just editing a variety of, documentaries, dramas, animations. And it was just, a fantastic kind of 3 years of being in this kind of creative bubble where everybody was there to kind of, do the thing that they wanted to do and be encouraged, every step of the way. It was fantastic.
And I suppose that's stark contrast to back home, where it sounds like there wasn't much of a sort of creative mindset. All of a sudden, you're now surrounded by creatives and like-minded people.
Exactly, yeah. It was, very much the case that, my parents didn't really understand how telly was made and didn't really have an interest in how it was made. But, they were very encouraging to me to kind of, if that was what I wanted to do, then fine, you work out how to do it and you go for it. But it was kind of like the blinkers were really taken off for me, particularly the year in America and then at the NFTS, where everybody is, the same as you, wanting to kind of, do that part of the filmmaking or TV making process that they want to do, and pick it apart, work out what works, work out what doesn't, why doesn't it work, why does it work. And it was just kind of a really kind of immersive and encouraging place to be, I think.
Yeah, I still to this day don't think my parents have a clue what I do for a living. Yeah. I think they've got some vague understanding, but it's one of those things, isn't it? It's very specific, and unless you've been involved in it in some capacity, it's quite hard to know. I've got a lot of friends who I don't really understand what they do for a living either. But so what was the path from? Because I'm always interested in the path from sort of study into working, because I come into contact with a lot of aspirational composers, people who finish their courses and they're trying to forge a path in the industry, and I imagine it's similar for editors. What was the journey from finishing at the NFTS to, and presumably, have you always been freelance or did you go in-house somewhere?
Well, again, it was purely down to a lot of luck, right place at the right time kind of thing, because as my course at the NFTS was coming to an end, it was very much a case of, I think there was 6 of us or 8 of us who were all editors. There was usually 8 of each specialisation at that time at the film school. So there was 8 editors, 8 drama directors, 8 documentary directors, etc. And as it came towards the end of our year, everybody was like, well, okay, what do we do now then? Because there was, amongst some people, there was sort of a slight expectation that, we've been to the NFTS, we'll walk straight out of here and get our dream job, and that's us. But that definitely wasn't the case. And you still had to kind of, look for work. Just because you were an NFTS graduate did not necessarily mean that you were an official editor. You can't just walk out there and say, hi, I'm an editor, give me something to edit. So I remember sort of starting to panic, thinking, yikes, am I just going to have to go back to Scotland and, look for work there, or what do I do? So I just kind of started going to the library at the NFTS, basically got all the trade magazines in every week. And I picked up Broadcast magazine one of the days and just started flicking through it. This is probably, I don't know, a month, maybe 2 months before we were due to graduate. And there happened to be an advert from a new post-production facility looking for a junior editor. I just thought, fine, I didn't care. I mean, there was some people, wanted to walk out of film school and go and be editing their first feature film. But for me, I didn't care. I just wanted to kind of be able to stay in London and survive, doing the job that I wanted to do. So I was happy to take anything. So I applied for this job, went and had an interview with the guy who ran this company. And he was like, yep, can you start in a couple of weeks? And I was like, yes. And it turned out that he'd set up this small post-production facility just up the road from Television Centre in Shepherd's Bush, because he'd just won the contract for cutting all the VTs for the Watchdog programme. It's like the consumer programme, which it used to be Anne Robinson who fronted it. So he just won the contract for that and just basically needed a couple of junior editors who could just churn out these, quite simple 5-minute VTs for this weekly magazine show. So I was hired from there, and I stayed as a staff member there for, I think it was just under 4 years. But, it was an amazing and perfect place to be largely because it was such a high kind of volume sort of turnaround production. There was different producers, different directors in there every week, just churning these things out. And as well as Watchdog, he then got the contract for the Holiday Programme, which was another BBC show, which was just basically celebrities going around the world showing what, package deals were currently available. So those were, again, little 5-10 minute VTs, some pretty shots of beaches, stick some music on it, make it look pretty, on to the next one. So again, it was just a high turnaround of producers, directors who, if you got on with them, they would then request you. So it's like, if they came back to do another film, they would say, oh, is Doug available? Yes. So I just basically ended up getting a contact list of people that I like to work with and who apparently like to work with me. And those people, similarly to me, were relatively junior. And so as they worked their way up, got better projects, left the BBC, went freelance or whatever, they would then still ring me and say, oh, are you interested in this? And so after 4 years as a staff editor, I just thought, okay, I'm having to turn down some of these really interesting sounding jobs because I'm staff. So I thought, okay, now or never, go freelance. And that was, 20 years ago or something.
Wow. I never looked back. Well, that's probably quite a nice little segue to go under the skin. Under the skin. Specifically, gone fishing. So how did that job come about?
That came about again through someone who I'd worked with previously. I had been doing it was a show for Sky called Richard E. Grant's Hotel Secrets, and the producer of that show, brilliant producer called Nikki Waltham, she. We just kind of got on really well, and she had been working with Paul Whitehouse on a different project at the same company that she was working at. And this was around the time when Bob had his heart issues. And so Paul was going fishing with Bob, taking him out to kind of, get him back into the world, to kind of recover from his triple heart bypass. And Paul had said to Nikki, "Oh, you should point a camera at us one day, because, you know, the stuff we are talking about is hilarious. We're having the best times." And so Nikki was like, this sounds interesting. So she got together with Lisa Clark, who's the executive producer of Gone Fishing. And she has worked with Bob Mortimer for years. She produced Shooting Stars and all the Vic and Bob stuff. And they sort of put their heads together and thought, actually, maybe there is something here. So they hired a director. He went out and shot kind of like almost like a pilot, like a taster tape kind of thing, where he just went to a riverbank with Paul and Bob, shot them fishing, trying to just kind of work out, okay, how would this work? Shot a couple of interviews with them, cut it together, and then they took that to the BBC, and they were like, "Yes, please, let's have it now." So it was quite a quick commission, if I remember correctly. And Nikki told me about it and said, "Would you be interested in doing it?" And I was like, "Absolutely," because, you know, I'd, you know, grown up watching The Fast Show and Shooting Stars, and just thought it sounded, you know, so insanely different to everything else out there that I just jumped at the chance. So she was like, "Let's do it." I met Lisa, and that was it. Away we went.
That first episode, when you get the rushes through, because obviously the music, I think what about Gone Fishing is a visual feast, because it's beautifully shot and it's usually in some stunning corners of the UK. But it's also, and there's the drone footage as well, which is lovely. But then also part of the charm as well is very much the music, which is very, I suppose it varies. There's a lot of acoustic guitar in there, but then there's also quite a lot of classical music, and then it almost feels like at certain times there's certain series which are maybe more jazz heavy. What's been your approach to, you received the rushes for the first sort of series or first episode? What were you thinking? How do you approach it?
I think it's kind of evolved a bit since the first series, because I think we were all kind of like finding our way on the first series. We didn't really kind of know what sort of show it was going to be. It was never intended to have voiceover, so I think that was the key kind of thing that we had to kind of work out to begin with. Was, okay, this has to make sense without any voiceover. So it's entirely Paul and Bob's voices. And, you know, they'd never done a show like this before, just kind of, you know, being themselves and, you know, doing something that, well, Paul had fished all his life, but Bob hadn't. So everybody was kind of feeling their way. And I remember from watching the first set of rushes, I think music was probably way down the list of things that we thought we needed to worry about. There was actually a point where we even thought, do we just try and tell this entirely with natural sound and not have music at all? Do we try and make it as different as that? And we did. If you actually watch back the first series, there's a lot less music in it than there is in the later series. I think because on the first series, it was more kind of like there was a bit more sort of like, it felt a bit more like nostalgia heavy, kind of trying to convey, you know, them thinking about the past, that kind of thing, and it was less about adding to the atmosphere of the place, whereas I think on later series we then started to kind of think, okay, let's kind of, you know, add to the ambience or the tone of this scene by having a little bit of simple piano or, you know, a bit of strings or whatever. So it was sort of a different approach, I think, back on series 1 than it is now. But in terms of what I think today, when I start watching rushes, I still kind of music. I try and it sort of comes to me after I've watched it in a way. I don't go into an episode thinking, oh, I really want to use so-and-so on this. It's very much, I always, my very first cut, I do entirely without music. I don't put music on until I've got it down to, I don't know, about 45 minutes or something. I sort of try and think, I let the storytelling kind of dictate what the tone needs to be. If they are talking about something melancholy, or if they're having a riotous laugh, I let that kind of inspire what the music then needs to do coming out of that scene. So I never have kind of a thought in my head of what the music's going to be before I press play on a fresh set of rushes.
Yeah. Okay. So you're very much letting the visuals and the tone of what you're seeing inform the musical choice. And the musical, am I right in thinking that the music is a combination? There is some production music or library music in there, and then there's obviously a lot of commercial music as well.
Mm. Yeah, I think the first couple of series there was very much, it was probably quite commercial heavy, but we kept coming up with various issues of getting clearance. In fact, we had the Chuck Berry song that used to be the title music. I think on the first, was it 2 series or 3 series? I think there was a point where I think Chuck Berry's estate were coming back and saying they wanted something like £30,000 per episode or something, just to be able to use that track as the title music. So it was like, okay, we can't afford that. So that was when they switched to, there was a Lisa, the exec producer, her husband is actually a music producer. So he was able to kind of get us, not quite a sound alike, but a similar kind of vibe track, which we now still to this day use as the title music, and various other kind of obstacles from BBC Music clearance. I think they started changing how easy it was to clear things. Anything with a North American copyright was an immediate no, so that became frustrating and problematic. So we did end up starting to use more sort of library and production music. Just because it was easier, and the time scales for editing these shows are so short that you could literally spend a month just finding the perfect music, but it usually turns out I have less than a week. So yeah.
Yeah. And does your music taste go some way to informing the tracks that you use? There's certain patterns, like I think there seems to be a lot of Richard Hawley on there, maybe Elbow get quite a lot of airtime. Is that indicative of your music taste?
To some extent. I mean, I had actually never heard of Richard Hawley until my other half took me to one of his gigs. We went to the Roundhouse in Camden, probably, I think it was about 2019, I think it was. And that was my first Richard Hawley experience, because she'd been a fan of his. She lived in Sheffield for a while and, knew his music a lot. But then I saw him live and was like, whoa, this has a perfect tone. And I was able to find, I think, 2 of his albums, instrumental versions. And as soon as I put some of that on, some of the Gone Fishing visuals, it just worked. It felt right. And Bob really liked it. Bob is very much involved in not specific choices, but if Bob doesn't like a certain track that I put on, he will say so, and then we'll get rid of it. Yes. But Hawley just seemed to click with him as well, and viewers seemed to love it as well. And we ended up, I think last year, Richard Hawley's manager even got in touch to actually say, oh, thanks for using all his music, because, we get so many people coming up to, at the gig saying, oh, did you hear so-and-so track on Gone Fishing? So it's quite nice that has definitely become a favourite. But I mean, in terms of like my own musical taste, I mean, to some extent, but, I listen to, some really terrible music. I was quite a big, pop music fan back in the 80s and 90s. I was obsessed with Stock Aitken Waterman stuff at a certain point. And, there's not a chance in hell that we'd ever get a Stock Aitken Waterman track on Gone Fishing, I don't think. Although I did try once.
What was the track?
It was Mel and Kim, Respectable.
Yes, okay. Respectable.
Exactly. But that didn't make it, funnily enough. But, you know, there's a lot of electronic music that I love. I love the Pet Shop Boys, but they never made it on the soundtrack. But I don't know, it varies. It's sort of like, the longer I've done this job, it's sort of like I listen to music in a different way now for pleasure. It's sort of like, because I'm always in the back of my mind thinking, oh, could I use that on something? 20 years ago, you just, you listen to your favorite bands because they were your favorite bands, not because, you could potentially use them on a TV show. So, yeah.
There's something very organic feeling about the music, it feels like it's primarily, or if not entirely, real instruments versus electronic music, which I suppose is in keeping with this very sort of outdoors and sort of landscape visual backdrop. But it's interesting you say as well about how doing this has changed how you listen to music. Has becoming an editor changed the way you watch TV, and similarly how you listen to music?
Definitely. It's changed the way I watch TV, I think, in the sense that I tend to kind of like, if we're watching something together in the house, if I find myself kind of like, not enjoying it for whatever reason, I can then kind of switch my viewing mode into kind of like looking at the editing or sort of thing. I love it when, you start watching a series and you're just immediately kind of like the plot, the storyline takes you away and you're in there. I love that. But if there ever comes a point where we're watching something where it doesn't, and I'm just sort of like, not doing it for me, I can find myself going, okay, right, I'm going to watch this scene from a perspective of trying to work out, okay, was this a 2-camera shoot or did they shoot it single camera and then cut afterwards? I'll try and sort of, listen out for, that was an ADR line there because you could hear the different acoustic quality or whatever. So, yeah, that's how I would definitely say I watch television differently. Music-wise, I think, yes, I definitely listen to music a lot less these days, partly because I think because I have to use it so much in my day job, it's sort of, it's less, other than commutes kind of thing, which are, the obvious time to sit and listen to music, or a podcast. I mean, that's the other thing. Podcasts take up so much time, and time is so precious these days. There just never seems to be enough time to kind of, you just, sit down and listen to an album from track 1 to track 12 or whatever. It's a different, I think listening to music is just a different experience. It feels more like you have to kind of think about it, or it has to be more of an event these days rather than, something for relaxation.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, if it's anything like me, because you spend all day with some kind of audio input, by the end of the day, I want silence. I don't want anything, because it can be just sort of a bit overwhelming. And the thing that speaks to as well, you mentioned podcasts. The irony that's what we're recording right now is not lost on me. But I have a tendency get up in the morning, and as soon as I leave the house, I'll put a podcast on my commute to work, and then I'll get to work and I'll spend all day listening to music, quite often the same thing over and over again, which is in of itself can be difficult. And then I'll walk home, and on the walk home as well, listen to another podcast. So there's very few hours in the day where don't have some kind of oral stimulus, and and it gets to a point where actually you do need respite. And I suppose it's a similar thing with messaging. If you think about the amount of information that we're exposed to on a daily basis compared to 20, 30 years ago, it's gone through the roof. And the effect of that is that I certainly find it can be a bit overwhelming. So to actually take a step back and have some spacing, right, no screens, no information, no music is actually a sort of a necessity come the end of the day.
I could recommend on that subject flotation tanks. Have you done one?
I have indeed done one. Yeah, they're incredible, aren't they?
Yes. Amazing, yeah.
Sensory deprivation. Go on then. So for anyone listening who doesn't know what a flotation tank is, explain.
It's basically like a large pod filled with, it's incredibly salty water, isn't it? So that you're kind of slightly buoyant. Yeah. And I remember the first time I went in there, I mean, it's mildly terrifying because you are kind of forcing your body to go into complete relaxation because you lie back in this pod with, it's less than a foot of water. You float, the lid comes down, and you're just left there in complete darkness, silence. And I think, well, you can have music kind of playing, I think, quietly if you want. But it is designed entirely for sensory deprivation, to completely try and switch your mind and body off and go into this sense of complete and total relaxation.
Yeah, and the state you come out of it in is quite remarkable, isn't it? In terms of what did somebody once refer to it as? It's like meditation. I can't remember. It was like meditation microwave or something like that. In that you could meditate for an hour, but once you throw in the magnesium salt, and I heard, and I might be misquoting this because I do sometimes do that with numbers, but there's something like 500 kilograms of magnesium salt in
really?
Dissolved in the water of any one tank, and you literally lie floating in that. It's at body temperature, isn't it? So it's not hot. So you're, I suppose, recreating weightlessness. And some people liken it to sort of being in the womb. It's the closest you'll come to being in the womb, having left it many years ago. And you come out, and it's just there's a sense of calm and relaxation. I sometimes find them quite, not at the time challenging, but weirdly my state when I come out, I can be not anxious, but I've had sort of very emotional experiences when I come out of the tank because you're forcing your brain to sort of shut down, and then I do wonder what happens subconsciously with subconscious processing. But yeah, it is an incredible experience. Getting a taste. I mean, we've touched on this briefly already, but I'm always interested to know the art that has shaped you and your creativity. You mentioned Star Wars, and what people won't be able to see is on the wall behind you is an original 1977 framed Star Wars poster. It sounds like that and Doctor Who were key elements of your creative growth. Are there any other things that you can, particularly visual things that you can think back to that you saw and thought, wow, okay, this is a game changer, this is like a seminal moment?
I think it was, being kind of child of the 70s and then going into the 80s, when that kind of, Hollywood cinema, and when Spielberg and George Lucas were doing, at the peak of their careers, I think, and John Williams, I mean, I'm sure everybody mentions him, but his music combined with their visuals, just did something that nobody else seemed to do. And I don't know, I remember buying the gatefold 12-inch vinyl of the Star Wars soundtrack and just listening to the Imperial March and the main theme over and over, and even the Cantina band, and just being completely even just listening to those notes, those themes, would transport my brain visually. And I don't know if it was a thing which, back in the day when you didn't have a VHS copy or a DVD copy to be able to watch it again, having the soundtrack, you could picture everything in your head because those themes were so evocative, visually. Whether it was Star Wars, whether it was Jaws, whether it was Indiana Jones, Close Encounters, all those movies, have kind of an iconic soundtrack attached to them, which, if you don't see a single visual, you play those tracks, immediately what they're from. Because, because there's fewer examples, I think, anyway, in recent cinema where there's like a proper iconic theme, or a collection of themes in the case of John Williams. I mean, so many soundtrack albums these days are, just a bit, kind of instrumentation. They don't tend to have those iconic fanfares or marches or whatever, which can evoke such visuals, I think, as those films did back in the 80s.
Do you have a theory as to why that is?
Probably largely just down to the genius of John Williams, because there aren't many composers like him. I think Hans Zimmer. I've loved some of the stuff that he's done recently as well on Blade Runner 2049 and the Dune movies have blown me away. I found Blade Runner 2049 just was one of the most astonishing experiences I think I've had in a cinema in years. I literally found I was in tears at the end of it, kind of because it was one of those it was a 70mm IMAX screening, and so everything was louder, everything was bigger, but I just found the way that the music, particularly at the end, when everything kind of quietened down, because it had such kind of dynamic range, I thought the music when it was used was so kind of like it got inside your body, when you can feel that bass kind of come up your feet, go into your gut and kind of vibrate your entire body. But then at the end, when it entirely goes and it's just, Ryan Gosling and Harrison Ford in the snow, Ryan Gosling lies down and they repeat those notes from the first Blade Runner of Tears in Rain, that just killed me. And having that kind of experience, where the music just fitted everything about that scene so well, and the entire movie, from the highs to the lows, the silences to the the multi-layered ground rattling bass, just kind of blew me away in a way that I hadn't felt, I don't think, since Star Wars practically.
Yeah, I think I felt that about Dune too. It felt like a cinematic event of the likes that I haven't experienced for a long time. And I literally came out, because I saw that at the IMAX, I came out feeling like I'd been assaulted, like both physically, mentally and orally assaulted over the course of the 2 hours, but in an incredible way. And it's funny because it sounds like very much a similar experience for Blade Runner for you. Music will evolve over time within cinema, and Hans Zimmer has been, for want of a pun very much intended, instrumental in that evolution. I think it was interviewed Nanita Desai who wondered whether sometimes directors like to sit on the fence emotionally rather than committing to a specific emotion, so that's where sometimes drones come in, is that you don't have to commit emotionally. You can provide something simple underneath and allow the viewer to make the decision, or the acting, the story to inform that more. But yeah, who knows? It's. I hope melody comes back though, because as you say, I think you're quite hard pushed to think of anything. Well, there's the old classic, isn't it? When you look at the Avengers films or the Marvel universe and challenge anyone to sing any one of the theme tunes from those, and it's very difficult to do because they're not particularly memorable. Probably not written to be so, but hopefully it will come back, because as you say, John Williams and the 80s heyday created some incredible soundtracks, which, as you say, you can listen to the music and it creates the picture in a way that you probably wouldn't be able to do with modern score. And we mentioned Richard Hawley, who sounds like has been a fairly recent discovery, but what about from your childhood through to today in terms of music? Are there any specific albums? You mentioned Pet Shop Boys and things like that, but specific albums, specific artists, specific songs which you really remember sort of having a profound impact?
So I don't think there was a specific album. I was sort of like, I do remember, my teenage crush was, going back to Stockgate and Mortimer again, I was obsessed with Kylie Minogue when she first kicked off in the late 80s. You should be so lucky. Exactly. But, I've been to several of her live shows. She knows how to put on a show. But I mean, that type of music, it's sort of like I think there's different types of music in the sense of whether I think I like electronic music just because of I like kind of repetitive rhythms. You know, a deep bass line does something to me, and you know, I in a way I won't listen to the lyrics in a way. Whereas someone like Richard Hawley or I remember NXS. I went to see NXS live in the early 90s, I think it was, before Michael Hutchence died. And that was kind of, and I started listening to a lot of their albums and realizing what an incredible songwriter he was. And his lyrics were kind of, you know, made me listen to lyrics for a change rather than, you know, it just being a hooky bass line or whatever. So I really enjoyed a couple of the early NXS albums. What else did I listen to? I was so kind of varied that I didn't have a specific, you know, there wasn't one album, I think, which sort of defined who I was, I don't think.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because it sounds like you've grown up listening to a lot of pop, but yet the soundtrack to Gone Fishing is, I mean, there are a few pop tracks on there. There's some Fergal, Sharkey and things like that, but it's predominantly much more acoustic and folky, and obviously the classical and jazz angles as well. If you don't have a sort of encyclopedic knowledge of that kind of music, how do you approach finding that kind of music for a show?
A lot of it, I mean, on the first series of Gone Fishing, Nikki, the producer, who I was sat next to in the edit for the entire duration, she's the type of person who does have an encyclopedic knowledge. So a lot of series 1 came from her. And then series 2, when it switched to, I had a director in for a lot of the edit, it then became a bit more of a back and forth kind of like, I mean, it got to the point of as simple as, well, let's try and make this a bit more folky. So, you know, just literally Googling who were, you know, the most interesting folk artists at the time, then just listening to lots of stuff. I mean, and it's kind of what I do now. It's sort of like when the pandemic hit and it very much, I then kind of became the sole person responsible for the music. It very much became a sort of part of the process of just literally, after I'd done a first cut of an episode, it's sort of thinking, okay, I want something that can evoke so-and-so, I want something that can do this. And then it's just a question of diving into Spotify, Deezer, looking at BBC Sounds, looking on various websites, just to kind of see who's interesting, listening just to lots of stuff, often quite randomly, until something, you know, does that thing where you think, oh, that could work. So it's very much a case of letting the visuals dictate what I think a scene needs to feel, or whether it's just something that just needs to be a bit of a transitionary track, so it doesn't need to kind of do much. And then just delving into a relatively random search, which can take, you know, hours, if not days. But I'll just I'll download just tons of tracks, import them into the Avid, and then just try stuff. I mean, the other thing that's been very useful actually in the past few years from the production music side of things is because so many music companies watch the show now and have since got in touch with me saying, oh, we'd love to give you some playlists of some tracks which we think could work in Gone Fishing. So I have, you know, been very welcome in accepting those playlists. So, you know, I've dread to think how many I've got now of various kind of, you know, folky, piano-led, sort of atmosy type tracks, pastoral stuff, which are kind of like a good fallback. I always kind of try and go for commercial first. Just, you know, it's good to kind of get a recognizable or a sort of some kind of nostalgic track early on in an episode, so that a viewer will go, oh, do you remember that? I love that kind of thing. And then the production music can then sort of be the underlying kind of more transition-y type of stuff. But yeah, it's a mix of random search. Occasionally there might be something where I think, oh, I remember hearing that track 3 years ago, I'll try and find that. But yeah, it's a bit random, really.
Yeah, it's funny because I quite a few years back I did some music for Universal, production music, and I remember at the time the producer talking about Gone Fishing. At this point I'd never seen it, but he was talking about Gone Fishing and the sort of lovely... it was Andrew Stannard who interviewed him on the podcast some time ago, but he was very much about sonic textures, and he was loving the sonic textures in... And I think this would probably been in the early days, maybe season 1, 2, 3. But I think as well, because a lot of that stuff has maybe been recorded a long time ago, so it's all recorded through analog equipment. And then sometimes it's sort of like, if it's... I don't know whether some of it has sort of vinyl crackle as well, because it's come from vinyl. And that, again, all goes to adding to this this sort of soft and very organic. And I always talk about imperfection, the danger with the digital age is that music can become very almost perfect, polished, as like vocals are always tuned and rhythm, drum beats can be put in time. But when you put a drum beat in time, you have a tendency to lose the groove, because the imperfections are what creates the groove. And similarly with a vocal performance, if it's tuned or too heavily processed, you lose the performance. And I think what he was really feeling about the music on Gone Fishing was it just felt so organic and so analog and so, I don't know, relatable, human. I think there's a humanity to music when it's in that state. But yeah, and then just thinking back, he referenced Gone Fishing, and I think that probably, I'm assuming that some of the references he gave me to do that album would have been on Gone Fishing. But as I say, this was before I was familiar with the show. So wonderful. Well, Doug, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. It's the part of the show now where we go deep with the quickfire questions. So the first question for you is, what's your favourite biscuit?
I did have a think about this. It's hard to define a single biscuit.
It really is. It's a very difficult question.
I would say, though, anything with raisins in it, I'm a raisin man. I do like a raisin. So an oatmeal raisin cookie, one of those kind of slightly soft ones that you get in Sainsbury's. Yeah,
they are good. They're definitely an old favourite. Okay, raisin-based, fruit-based cookies. See, I think I don't know, a lot of people just don't go for that, do they? It's like, why would I have raisins when I can have chocolate chips? But I think it's an acquired, for the discerning gentleman, if you will.
Indeed.
What do you do to let off steam? Oh, flotation tanks, other than...
Flotation tanks, and the other thing that I have done regularly now for, about 10 years, is yoga. Because we're sat like this all the time. I do a 90-minute yoga class at least once a week, quite often twice a week, and absolutely love it. It's absolutely improved my posture, he says, sitting more upright.
Yes.
But yeah, I think it's crucial for anybody, I think, who sits down for too many hours a day to do something. Because the older that I get, you do start to feel those pains, but yoga is definitely keeping me flexible, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, as you get older, your muscles become increasingly inelastic, so it's even more important. But it's a sign of such sedentary lifestyle that we lead, isn't it? And yoga. I've done it quite a bit myself, and it definitely makes a huge difference in just everything, just your entire sort of whole skeleton functioning properly.
Yes.
What's a little known fact about you?
Has it got to be related to my work?
No, could be anything. Just something that a lot of people must go, oh, I never knew about that about you, Doug.
Oh, actually, I didn't drink alcohol for most of my life. I didn't start drinking until I was in my 30s. Strangely, all the way through university, which is usually the time in everyone's life where their alcohol intake is at its peak, pretty much.
Yeah.
I just decided that I didn't want to drink.
You must have been so incredibly productive, because I think about the amount of time I getting wasted. Not even so much getting wasted, but the fallout the following day where I wasn't capable of functioning back then it was 24 hours until I'd recovered, but now it'd be 48, maybe 72. But yeah, wow. What scares you?
Probably it would be something obvious, like, losing my sight.
Oh.
Just because, everything that I do is just defined by audio visual. Whereas I think if I was to lose my sight, at least if I still had my hearing, you can visualize things because of being able to hear them. But I think losing sight is just sort of, doesn't bear thinking about.
It's funny you say the obvious, but actually in all the episodes, not one person has mentioned that as a fear. And you'd think as well, maybe with composers, particularly the fear would be of losing their hearing. But that's an interesting one. And finally, what piece of advice would you give to your younger self?
Probably just to not be scared and not be so nervous, because everything around me when I was young was, including some of my teachers at school, were saying, why do you want to go into TV or film? It's like, what's that all about? You'll never do that. And I would just say, stick to your guns, don't be scared, go for it. And because, that's what I did, and look at me now. Yeah,
I think so. Isn't it sad as well that the people that were in charge of your education were the people who was poo-pooing your dreams, and rather than you'd hope that those people should be encouraging it and encouraging you to dream and dream big. But I suppose maybe that's indicative of a small town. I certainly think, I always feel like growing up in the north of England, doing anything media related, sort of music, drama, anything like that was never an option. It's just because people up there generally have never had experience with it. It's, get a proper job sort of thing, whereas come down to London and it's very much a reality, and there's tens of thousands of people doing it on a daily basis. So good for you for sticking to your guns and going, actually, do you know what? No, I'm gonna make this happen with or without your encouragement.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's lovely, Doug. Thank you so much for taking time to chat. It's been a fascinating insight into editing generally, but certainly gone fishing, and such an incredible program, and looking forward to, is it season 8 or 7 or 8?
Series 8. Yes, we've shot 2, I've edited 2 episodes, then they start filming again next month, I think it is.
Okay.
So yes, Series 8 on its way.
Looking out for that. And where can people find you? Do you social? Do you hang out online, or?
I do social, yes. I'm on all the main platforms, usually under the guise of Editor Doug. So I'm usually quite easy to find.
At Editor Doug. And
yes.
Doug Bryson what's your website? I can't remember it.
Oh yeah, DougBryson.com.
DougBryson.com.
It's my website.
Well, I will link to all of those in the show notes. But again, Doug, thanks for taking the time to chat.
No problem at all.
Thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, and given that you've listened this far, I feel you might have, then I would be honoured and incredibly grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe, rate and review on your podcast platform of choice. By subscribing, you'll automatically be notified each time a new episode drops, and by rating the show, you tell the artificial intelligence that will soon be running the world that this podcast is worth listening to. I certainly get a lot of insights and value from these conversations, and I genuinely hope you do too. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, then you can email me, podcast@larpmusic.com. Larpmusic.com is my digital abode, and the home of the podcast is larpmusic.com/Sync Music Matters Podcast. And Sync Music Matters Podcast is hyphenated. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.